Is the 18.4 video, political and social change, mainly throughout England and France and other parts of Europe, I guess you could say. In this one here, the three main ideas we're going to be dealing with are the Magna Carta, the 100 Years' War, and the Black Death. All right, here we go. As I go through this, please fill out your guiding questions for 18.4. All right, first of all, what is the Magna Carta? The Magna Carta was a document that was signed in the year 1215 by King John. King John was tricked into coming out to a place outside London called Runnymede, where he was surrounded by some of his noblemen. They were very upset with him, with some of the laws that he was putting into place that was actually hurting these noblemen. A lot of these laws had to deal with taxes that they thought were unfair. They were also upset with him taking some of the lands that the king had given these nobles and then giving that land to other people. So they tricked him into coming out there, and they wanted him to sign this document, and they pretty much told him, hey, either sign this document or we're going to kill you out here. So King John will sign this Magna Carta. The Magna Carta means Great Charter. And in this Magna Carta, it was basically just a document that listed the rights of the noblemen that the king could no longer ignore. All right, so one of the reasons why they did this is they wanted to limit the rights of the king. They wanted to limit, I shouldn't even say the rights, they wanted to limit the power. The king had been creating new taxes on these nobles, taking their land, things like that. What's really going to become a big deal then is this Magna Carta becomes kind of the first document in recorded history that will limit a king's power over the people that he rules over. And it will be used as inspiration, in the late 1700s when our founding fathers write the U.S. Constitution, the Declaration, and the Bill of Rights. Now, there were three main things in the Magna Carta that the noblemen wanted to make sure the king followed. Number one was habeas corpus. This idea, habeas corpus means you own your own body. What was happening is the king was putting some of his political enemies in prison and not charging them with any crimes or anything like that. Well, the noblemen didn't want that to happen anymore. They wanted to make sure that if the king and his police were going to arrest people, that they were actually charged with some type of a crime. Another thing that they wrote into their Magna Carta is that even the king had to obey all the laws. No longer could the king be above the law. They actually had to obey the laws, as did everybody else. And then the final thing is this idea of if you are accused of a crime, you need to be put on trial, but the trial is no longer going to be in front of the king or any of just the king's men. It's going to be a trial by jury. And on the jury will be people that are kind of like the defendant. So it's called a jury of your peers. And that's what we still have today in our country. So the noblemen were saying, we don't want to be put on trial and be in front of the king or king's men being on the jury. We want the jury that's going to be of other noblemen, and they will find out whether I am guilty or not. So huge change with this Magna Carta. Now, to keep the Magna Carta in place or keep this idea of limiting the king's power, what's going to be set up is this Council of Nobles. It's called the Parliament. So the Parliament, I believe on page 542, you can kind of see where the Parliament first meets. It's in like the 1230s, so about 10 years after this document is signed, the first Parliament will meet, and it's the Parliament now that is going to be the lawmaking body of England. Now, there will be times where Parliament has a lot of power, where they make the rules, even the king has to follow and all that. There will be other times as we get moving forward where really the king starts to exert his power again and the Parliament really doesn't have much power. But that will be the dynamic in England from here on out, is this battle between the king and the Parliament over who really has power in England. They will require everyone to follow the law, and it freed the court system away from being a court that was specifically there just to do whatever the king wanted. Now it's going to be a court system that is supposed to rule by law. Okay, not always does it happen, but it makes the system a lot better than it used to be. And then this will be kind of an inspiration for us in America. All right, so that's pretty much with the Magna Carta. Number two is this 100 Years' War. As you can see, the dates of the 100 Years' War is roughly 1323 to 1453, right in there. This is going to be a fight between England and France for power over Europe. What starts this war is that the King of France is going to die. But the biggest problem is he dies with no sons, which means there's no true heir to the throne. Who's going to be the next king? And that's where a French man and a king of England are both going to claim they should be the king. Eventually, in this year or so, in the first year or so, the French man becomes the king of France. And this is going to upset the king of England to where about 3 years later, the king and he will lead an army and they will invade France. And this invasion kind of starts this 100 Years' War. Now, off and on it goes, of course, for 100 years. You're going to have down periods of like 10 years where there's not much fighting, and then you're back on to fighting for another 15 years, back and forth, things like that. But after a long time of fighting, eventually you get this young peasant girl. She's about 17 years old, name of Joan of Arc. Joan of Arc is going to lead her own army. She says she sees visions from God to lead the army to victory for France, and she does it. She's very good at it. Eventually, she is captured by the English. There's some controversy over how she was captured and things like that, maybe turned over by some of her own French people. But she's going to be put on trial for heresy, for what the English accuse her of speaking untruths about the church, and she's burned at the stake. But with her death, it rallies the French people. They will rally around her death, and ultimately they will drive the English out of France in the year 1453. Now, some of the effects of, here's that slide about her driving out the English in 1453. Some of the major effects is, okay, how does the King of England, how's he going to be treated when this war is over? Basically, the King of England loses his power. The Parliament has quite a bit of power by the end of this war. In France, it's just the opposite. The French king has like ultimate power at this time. The noblemen and all that, they'll support the king and whatever the king wants to do. All right, let's move on to the Black Death now. Okay, how did the people of Europe get the Black Plague? Well, it has to deal with trade. After the Crusades and things like that, where a lot of people from Europe had been over in the Middle East, they come back to Europe. One of the things that they're going to do is they're going to continue trading with the Middle East and Asia and things like that. Unfortunately, one of the bad things that comes across the Mediterranean on the ships and docks in Italy and other places of Europe is the Black Death. Fleas will carry it from infected rats. These fleas then will latch onto people throughout Europe and put it into their bloodstream. It's a disease that you can't taste, you can't touch, you can't feel, you can't see, anything like that. But once you have the disease, it kind of courses through your body pretty quickly, and it's a painful death. You get these boils on your skin and things like that. Eventually, the boils will burst, and that's where the black comes from, the Black Death, because the blood had turned black. It was diseased. In some instances, fingers and toes and things like that, the skin turned black. It was very, very gruesome. And people just didn't know how to deal with it. There was really no understanding of how to treat it. Lots of different ways to try to treat it. Some of the things is just kind of slicing open the boils to let the bad blood out, putting leeches on the skin to suck the bad blood out. Nothing was happening. And people lived in constant fear. As you can see, for this 4-year time period was the worst, because that's where more like 25 million plus were going to die in Europe. People were looking to the church for help, but the church couldn't solve anything either with this. They tried different things, tried to say it was God's way of punishing people, but pretty soon a lot of people just didn't even accept what the church had to say. And it was just a horrible place. In some respects, in England alone, there's talk about over 1,000 villages just abandoned. People were died, or they left these villages to never return. It's devastating what happened to Europe and in this Black Death. All right, but out of that Black Death, here are some of the things that will continue afterwards and make changes. And one of the things is feudalism, the system we talked about long ago, was already kind of dying out after the Crusades. It's really the Black Death that's going to kind of issue a final death blow to feudalism, because of the serfs. Those that survived, the peasants and the serfs that survived, their skills are in high demand now. A lot of workers died from the Black Death. Those that are left over, they can now demand more pay. They can demand better working conditions. Many peasants and serfs will now leave the manor, leave these small villages out in the countryside. They don't want to be farming anymore or anything like that. They go to the cities where the jobs are. And so now you start to see this really big shift in Europe after the Black Death, a move away from the countryside to the farms. And as you can see, the impact of the Black Death in here, impact on the church, impact on the economy, and impact on society. Okay? Customs like feudalism just die away. It's pretty much gone. You're going to see deaths create a shortage of qualified priests. You have this right here with fewer consumers. The prices of goods drop. So now as a peasant or serf, maybe I can afford better things now than I used to be able to. But with that fewer laborers, I can actually make more money also because my skills are in higher demand. So out of devastation, the Black Death, there does come some good within Europe, and that is moving away from the feudalistic system. All right, that's pretty much where we end section 4 for chapter 18. Dealing with that Black Church or the Black Death. But what's going to happen in the next section, we do take a look at the church, this church that has kind of been the stabilizing force ever since the fall of the Roman Empire throughout Europe. The church is, going to have some problems coming up down the road. There are going to be challenges to the church, and there's going to ultimately be a big split that we're going to talk about in the church in chapter 19. But that's it for this one here. So thank you guys for listening, and please make sure you filled out your notes for this here. Have a great day.